It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the ASUS ROG Strix XG27UCDMG. As usual for video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. You'll find additional content related to this video in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support. This monitor uses a 27-inch, or more accurately 26.5-inch, Samsung display QD-OLED panel. And it sports a 3840 by 2160, that's 4K UHD resolution and 240Hz refresh rate. So with this screen size and the resolution, you get an excellent pixel density, so you get a really nice crisp look to text and suitably high resolution image content. Yes, this text is indeed very small, I'm not using scaling, but if you wish to use scaling or application-specific zoom, you can of course do that. Things will look bigger and potentially more readable for you, but you still benefit from the high pixel density of the screen in terms of things looking crisp, at least if the applications are scaling cleanly, which many do these days. I'm now going to look at the refresh rate supported by the monitor and some associated features. So the monitor is officially certified as G-Sync compatible by NVIDIA via both HDMI and DisplayPort, so it has been specifically tested by them for VRR capability and passed certain required quality checks. The monitor supports DP 1.4 with DSC, and in this image here I'm connected via DisplayPort. So if you compare this to, for example, the MSI MPG272URX I recently reviewed, that uses DisplayPort 2.1 or supports DisplayPort 2.1. But I noticed no difference at all in the image quality or functionality with my RTX 5090. I'm able to use the full capabilities including DSR and DLDSR, and I have no delays when alt-tabbing or that sort of thing. It's possible there is very specific content that could show some sort of minor difference between DSC being used, as it is here, versus not being used, as with the MSI model for example, via DisplayPort 2.1, but for most users and users, you shouldn't expect a difference. I do know some people still like to have the latest display standard on their monitor, but personally I wouldn't pay a premium for DisplayPort 2.1 on a 240Hz 4K UHD display like these. So you've got support for up to 240Hz at the 4K UHD resolution and up to 10 bits per channel at the same time. You've got HDR support on top as well as VRR support. You can disable DSC on the screen if you're using an older GPU generation such as the RTX 40 series or older, which will allow you to access DSR and DLDSR. Whether using a monitor with DisplayPort 1.4 like this one or DisplayPort 2.1 like the MSI, you don't have access to these features unless you disable DSC. With DSC disabled, you're limited to a maximum of 120Hz with the limited range RGB signal at the native resolution, or up to 97Hz, a refresh rate the monitor specifically supports exactly for this reason, and you'll see that listed in the image, with an 8-bit full-range RGB signal. Note that 97Hz isn't listed if you're using OLED Anti-Flicker. Via HDMI, it's the same story in terms of my RTX 5090 allowing all NVIDIA features to be used, even with DSC active. So you've got support for up to 240Hz and you've got up to 12 bits per channel. There's a very slim amount of content out there that'll actually make use of 12 bits per channel, but if you need that support, you can do it via HDMI. And with DSC disabled, when you're using HDMI, you can run 120Hz with a full range RGB signal at up to 12 bits per channel. Here are some additional refresh rates listed via HDMI. So you'll see support for various different lower refresh rates, including 24Hz. And for those interested, these are full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, 48 gigabits per second. And as with DisplayPort, you have support for HDR and VRR via HDMI. And because it's full feature HDMI 2.1, that includes HDMI 2.1 VRR support, which you could use on the PS5, which doesn't support adaptive sync. You can also use NVIDIA G-Sync compatible on NVIDIA GPUs, but there's also adaptive sync for FreeSync support on compatible systems and AMD GPUs. I'm now going to talk about the scaling or interpolation capability of the screen. So at the moment I'm running at the full native resolution, so no scaling is going on. If you're using the OLED Anti-Flicker setting, then you'll notice that certain resolutions aren't listed, including the 2560 by 1440, 1440p or QHD resolution, and you can't access the aspect control settings, which are your scaling settings, which I'll show you shortly. I've now got the game running at 2560 by 1440, 1440p QHD resolution, so to achieve that I had to disable OLED Anti-Flicker, and it will support up to 120Hz, but I couldn't use this at 240Hz. If you wanted to use 240Hz with this resolution, you could just use GPU scaling instead, and actually the effect with the monitor scaling versus GPU scaling, it's pretty similar anyway. And that is to say that things have a little bit of a softer look than I'd like to see, so softer than you'd see on a native screen that's QHD of this kind of size. But it's not too bad. It's a moderate softening, not a heavy softening. And you can also counteract this. And the setting you'd want to use to do that is called Vivid Pixel. So if you increase this above the default of 50, then it will sharpen things up for you. Even set to 100, I don't actually find the effect extreme like I do with the sharpness control on some monitors. So you might actually like to go all the way up to 100. I think 80 strikes quite a nice balance, at least for the QHD resolution I'm looking at here. I'm now running the full HD resolution at 120Hz, so I'm using the monitor's scaling, and things look pretty soft compared to how they would look on a native screen of this size and resolution. So I want to increase the Vivid Pixel setting, set to the default of 50 at the moment. For this one, I'd say again, 80 is pretty well balanced, although perhaps pushing it a little bit further up may be preferred for this resolution, all the way up to 100 perhaps. Again, it's personal preference. Some elements do look just a little bit over-sharpened now, but others look pretty good. So overall, I think it's a pretty good scaling algorithm that's used here. And the Vivid Pixel setting works quite well without introducing ridiculous levels of extreme over-sharpening. And remember, if you're using GPU scaling, you can also use the Vivid Pixel setting. I've returned now to the native 4K UHD resolution and set the Vivid Pixel to the default value of 50. The other aspect, no pun intended, to go through is aspect control, so the scaling settings. 16:9 full is the default behaviour, or specifically with the fill-up setting, but there's a 24.5-inch simulation setting if you prefer a black border and things to look like a 24.5-inch screen. And you can use this whether you're using the native resolution or a non-native resolution. As it says there, though, the following function will be disabled: ELMB and PIP P/P. Let's get back into the game. So you can see there's a black border now, and things are sort of crushed into the 24.5-inch area. I think the setting works pretty well. As far as settings of this nature go, it doesn't make the image look super weird like some kind of settings like this can do. One thing I've noticed though, it doesn't seem to run at 240Hz now. If I try and change it to that, it just switches it back to 120Hz, so maybe that is a restriction with this setting. And another option is pixel by pixel. So that will only use the pixels called for by the source resolution. In this case, it's the native resolution, so nothing's happening. So that's the full HD resolution with the 1:1 aspect setting selected. So you can see a huge black border around the image, as you'd expect, but the image itself, a perfectly crisp but small full HD view. And the same now, but with the QHD resolution. So you can see a smaller but still large black border. And the image itself, a nice crisp, undistorted QHD representation. And there's also a square operating mode, which will change the resolution for you. Or at least it should do, it seemed to on the desktop. I'm just going to close the game because sometimes the scaling's a bit weird on the game and doesn't always react well unless you set the scaling setting before opening the game. Anyway, you can see it on the desktop, that's the square setting. And that was with full. There's also equivalent, which will give black borders, so it's not stretching it as it was before. And you'll see it switches over to the 1280 by 960 resolution. And finally, pixel by pixel. I'm now going to look at the external features of the monitor. So it has ROG Strix styling, so it's a bit pared back compared to the ROG Swift styling. That includes a plasticky stand base and neck, although it's quite robust, so I feel that overall it has quite a premium feel, actually quite a solid feel, even though it is plastic. It also has a little slot on the stand if you want to put your phone or perhaps a tablet there. And there's a little red accented ring just for a little bit of visual contrast. Cable tidy loop as well. The top and side bezels are dual stage, so you have a reasonably slim panel border as well as a hard plastic outer part. There is also an active area between the image and the panel border, which the screen shifts around with every now and then for its pixel shifting feature, or whatever it is ASUS calls it, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's the same kind of feature you get on other OLED monitors. There's also this little underhanging unit, and that has a little illuminated ROG logo, which you can disable if you prefer. It's also used for the neo proximity sensor, so a little IR sensor there. which is explored in the best settings video. The screen surface on this one, it's the usual QD-OLED affair, so it's glossy with an effective anti-reflective surface. So there is strong direct light there, and you can see a few things. First of all, you can see reflection, and second of all, you can see that there's a colourful tint imparted. That's just a white door, it isn't sort of this weird magenta-y, purpley colour. But that is what happens with bright enough lighting conditions. You do get this colourful tint on the screen. I'll just brighten up a little bit more. You'll start to see that instead of the screen looking black, it sort of has this haze to it. So that is something you have to be aware of in brighter lighting conditions. For more controlled lighting conditions, it's a good screen surface. It does have some benefits because it's glossy, which I explore later in the review. And for those interested, the stand, it has quite a compact footprint in my opinion for a gaming monitor. The stand, I kind of like the simple design personally. It's nothing too fussy, and it also doesn't take a massive amount of desk space. So the depth of the stand, for those interested, it's around 215mm, which is just shy of 9 inches. You can tilt the screen, you can swivel it left and right, you can pivot it into portrait, and you can adjust the height. That's what it looks like at lowest height. So it's nice and low to the desk, and at highest stand height. You get 120mm or 4.72 inches of height adjustment. At the rear, you can see various different styling elements, as they usually use. There is a graphene heatsink used, so the monitor doesn't have a cooling fan, it just is passively cooled, so you don't have to worry about a potentially audible fan ruining your experience. There's also a camera screw or tripod mount at the top of the stand neck. There is an illuminated ROG logo here, with a little pixel effect. And just to give you a super quick demonstration of the Aura RGB lighting feature, it doesn't do anything from you from the front. It really gives a very gentle glow, which you can't really appreciate from the front. But if you can see the back of the monitor, then you can see this little pixelated ROG logo. It's just doing its default rainbow cycle. There are a few other options as well. You can just disable it completely if you want by turning it off. You can have it cycle different colours, also static colours. You can select red, green, blue, cyan, magenta or yellow. And you can do it breathing or strobing, so different flashing patterns as well if you prefer. And I'll just quickly mention, because I know some people have asked me this in previous ASUS monitor videos, yes, you can disable that red ROG logo there if you wish, and that is under System Setup, Power Indicator. Goodbye. The ports face downwards. You've got an AC power input, so there's an internal power converter. There are 3 USB 3.2 Gen 1 downstream ports, as well as a Type B upstream. There are 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, and there's a USB-C port with DP alt mode, 90 watts of power delivery, and upstream data. The monitor does have KVM functionality with easy switching of inputs and USB sources, so you can share USB peripherals easily between multiple systems. You can create shortcuts in the OSD, so it's easy to switch between the sources. And there's a 3.5mm headphone jack. The monitor does not include any integrated speakers. Oh, and also, just forgot to mention, the stand attaches using a quick release mechanism. You can easily detach the included stand, and that will reveal provision for 100 by 100mm VESA mounting. We're now going to take a quick look at the subpixels of the monitor. So as usual for a QD-OLED, they're arranged in a triangle RGB layout, where there's red and blue, but then there's the green subpixel displaced above the red and blue, rather than things being arranged in an even RGB stripe layout, side by side. But on the left bit of the image there, you can see what the first generation QD-OLED panel looked like, whereas this 4th generation QD-OLED panel has changed a bit, and you can see that at the right. So there are 2 main things here. One is that the subpixels are now squared out more. That was a change which happened with the 2nd generation QD-OLEDs. So basically when they went from the ultra-wides to the 16:9 QHD models, the 27-inch models, this was a change they made right away there. But then this one combines that with a very good pixel density, an excellent pixel density, 166 ppi, whereas the 27-inch QHD models and the 34-inch ultra-wides, they have a 110 ppi pixel density. That's pixels per inch, by the way. So there's an article on the website that looks at fringing issues which occur on QD-OLEDs and indeed WOLED monitors. It's definitely worth checking that out if you're not familiar with this, and even if you are familiar with this, it's probably worth checking it out anyway. You might learn some new stuff about the fringing issues in the article. Anyway, the fringing issues aren't really an issue on this monitor in my view. Because the pixel density is so tight and because the subpixels have been adjusted to that squared out design, together those mean that the fringing is so very minuscule that you really shouldn't notice it. Most people just won't notice it. Now, I can't say that no one's going to notice it. I can only tell you what I notice subjectively, but when I'm using the monitor for my normal viewing distance, let's say eyes 60 to 80 centimeters from the screen, I really have to look out for the fringing to notice it. It doesn't just punch me in the face or anything like that. So some examples I gave in the article where the fringing might be noticed would be this table of contents, for example, because there's a solid black box with a white background. Here, if I look closely enough, yes, I can see a really small fringe, but it really is so small that I do have to look closely and specifically look out for it. Another example where I said it was quite noticeable, certainly on the first generation QD-OLED panels, was this taskbar here. So it's a dark taskbar with the white in the background, again contrasting edges. And again, I can kind of see a fringe. It's actually a bit more noticeable here to me than the table of contents example, but even then, it's just not bothersome at all. And as for looking at text, I find this absolutely fine. So for most people, really using this monitor, it's going to just feel like using an IPS LCD of a similar pixel density in terms of how text is represented and other contrasting elements. So fringing on this one just isn't something I'd worry about. Moving on now to the calibration of the monitor. The gamma readings given in this table were taken using a Calibrite colorimeter, and the white point was taken using a data color colorimeter. So various different settings were used here. The white point was a little bit on the warm side compared to the usual 6500K target I go for, although the green channel was nicely balanced, so that wasn't a problem. It wasn't too strong or too weak, and therefore didn't impart a green tint or anything like that. The gamma sits fairly close to the 2.2 target, 2.16 out of the box using racing mode. I also looked at the display color space settings, which emulate sRGB and DCI-P3 for the color gamut, similar gamma tracking and white point with those. And the sRGB cal mode, although it appears similar in this table, there are some differences to be aware of there, and I will cover this in more detail shortly. You can also see I said there that uniform brightness was enabled for consistency, and I show how I set the monitor up for my test settings. These are also covered in the best settings video if you're interested in that. And as I note at the bottom there, individual units and preferences vary. These won't be optimal in all cases. ICC profiles aren't used in the review, but I have included one created using the test settings in the description of the video if you wish to try it out. And just a note before I move on here, I also like to look at the color temperature 4000K setting, or basically a strong low blue light setting, which gives a nice well-balanced look to the image. I also talk about this a little bit in the best settings video, but I found it gave a nice warm amber tint to the image. I measured it at 3870K white point, so close to the reported or intended 4000K. And gamma happened to be spot on 2.20 on average. Looking at the gamma in a bit more detail now, this is under my test settings. It tracks quite close to 2.2 overall. Some shades are just a little bit brighter and some a little bit darker than intended. For 2% grey, so that's the darkest shade measured here, a gamma of 2.3 was recorded. This means some very dark shades are slightly darker than intended, but not enough to really be considered significant black crush. Overall gamma characteristics were quite similar, using most of the other settings tested in the table, including with display color space switched to sRGB or DCI-P3. This graph shows the sRGB cal mode's gamma tracking, which is very different, and that switches from a linear 2.2 gamma target to an sRGB gamma target, as you can see in the graph. There's a progressive reduction in gamma as shades become darker, which lifts them up significantly and increases how visible and obvious such shades are, and how much they stand out against pure black, for example. It's really personal preference whether linear 2.2 gamma or sRGB gamma tracking is preferred, but it's not unusual for an sRGB emulation setting to include sRGB gamma tracking, and some will like the uplifted look it gives. If you don't, then you could use an alternative sRGB emulation if required, for example sticking to the display color space sRGB setting. And a look now at the sRGB color accuracy. This is using the sRGB color space setting, with a delta E average of 1.59, pretty good overall. You can see the largest error, as usual, is shade 1F cerulean. And by the way, these are the data color Spider Checker 48 test patches. But anyway, that shade 1F, it's pretty much always the highest error. Slight differences in the balance of green and blue can just completely throw off the accuracy of that particular shade. I wouldn't be too concerned about this. The overall performance is pretty good here. Switching over to the sRGB cal mode, that actually improves the average delta E to 1.04 from 1.59. Again, shade 1F is the outlier, the highest value. Well, it's marginally lower than it was before. It was 5.41 before, now it's 4.91. But all of the sort of more colourful shades, the more saturated colourful shades below 1F, they're presented very nicely now. As I cover in the best settings video though, the sRGB Cal mode is a lot more restricted than just setting the display colour space to sRGB. You can adjust the brightness, but you can't adjust the gamma or the colour temperature, for example. Taking a look now at the contrast and brightness performance, starting off with some figures. The table here shows the white luminance recorded. Because it's an OLED, the black luminance is always recorded as 0.00, and therefore it gives an infinite contrast ratio. So it's really just the white luminance we have to focus on here. Various different conditions were tested, and you'll also notice there's a range given for the white luminance values. The reason for that is that, as usual for an OLED, there is some ABL, automatic brightness limiter behavior. It can be restricted if you use the uniform brightness setting, although it doesn't completely kill that off. And what I do here is I have the test patch in the middle of the screen, so the white test patch, and it's surrounded by various other shades. So desktop backgrounds showing pure black, pure white, and various other shades between them, various images. So it really captures a very broad range of ABL behavior on the monitor that you might observe by eye when you're just using it. But if you actually are using the uniform brightness setting and using 100% brightness, you would get 258 to 266 nits, fairly decent for a QD-OLED, and also it doesn't have a huge adjustment range, so it's fairly tight in terms of its ABL behavior. If you do want it to be brighter, you could turn uniform brightness off, then you can get 266 to 461 nits. How bright it will be will depend on the makeup of the image and how many bright shades are displayed. And it goes down to 14 to 15 nits, so that's nice and dim. That's with uniform brightness enabled. If you have uniform brightness disabled, it's 16 to 24 nits. Most people will actually set their monitor somewhere between 100 and 200 nits, so this monitor is certainly capable of that. Yes, people do have their own preferences either side of that, and if you like really high brightnesses, then LCDs are probably a better choice for you. You can see various other settings in the table. Don't have to go through these, you can just look at them in your own time. With uniform brightness enabled, as it was in all of the cases except for where I say uniform brightness off, there isn't a huge amount of ABL behavior to worry about. Be aware that, as usual for an OLED monitor, there is slight flickering to the backlight, but it isn't like PWM pulse width modulation flickering. It's just that there are some slight cyclical brightness dips matching the refresh rate of the display. Much less intense than PWM flickering, less extreme changes in brightness, and most people don't notice these, don't have an issue with them, even if they're sensitive to PWM flickering. But some people are sensitive to this, so I do have to mention that. You can't consider it truly flicker-free in the same way that an LCD with DC dimming on the backlight would be. I'm now on good old Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance using some in-game examples. As usual for an OLED, you get per pixel dimming precision, and you get that essentially infinite contrast ratio. So if you're sitting in a dark room, as I am now, or a dimly lit room, then you experience exceptional depth to these dark shades and a nice variety of dark shades as well. Really nice depth to these medium shades. Just a generally atmospheric and inky look, which can be really lovely. And of course, you don't have this upset by any glow of any type, so no IPS glow or... Oh, that was a bit foreboding, that skull. So yeah, sorry, no IPS glow or VA glow or anything like that. And exceptional consistency to the gamma, so in terms of the detail of the dark shades, they're presented in very much the same way, regardless of where they're presented on the screen. As I noted earlier, just minor black crush on my unit. The average gamma was 2.3 for the very dark shades. I have to say, by eye, it's not something that really jumps out at me at all. It's there, but it's mild. And remember, this is under SDR I'm talking about here at the moment. Of course, we don't all sit in a cave or a dark or indeed dimly lit room. So this is what happens when you lighten things up a bit, but this is not a bright room. It's very much controlled lighting. I've just let a little bit of daylight in. As usual for a QD-OLED, there is a lightening up of these dark shades because the screen itself does lighten up and it takes on a bit of a grey rather than sort of more of a black appearance to things. And it can also take on tints. It depends on the room lighting. If it's bright enough, then you can actually notice some more colourful tints, like I showed you earlier in the features and aesthetics section. But in these particular conditions, it's mild. So, things really do look still nice and atmospheric and deep overall. Because it's a glossy screen, it doesn't haze things up. The image isn't diffused across the screen, and competing light from the room. It doesn't haze across and create this, glare patches which compete with the image. In this kind of lighting, you really don't have to worry about reflections. The screen surface does have effective anti-reflective properties. I've brightened things up more, and in fact, this is really obnoxious lighting here because you get strong direct light striking the screen surface there, so you can see a reflection. You can also see a bit of a colourful tint to things. Things are lightened up, so things just aren't presented as nicely now. This isn't a super bright room, it's just that I've managed to introduce some uncontrolled lighting striking the screen there. So yeah, I mean, you can still use it in these conditions, but to really benefit from the OLED look which you want with the depth that I was talking about earlier, you really want to avoid light striking the screen directly if you can, or just being in a very bright room. I know this is not so easy for some people as it is for others. I do personally have good control of my lighting, even if I have a little bit of daylight or artificial lighting in my room. The artificial lighting is behind my monitor, the daylight is controlled so I've got an anti-glare blind at one side and closable doors elsewhere. So it's alright for me, but if you can't control the lighting environment so well, I do appreciate that this screen surface could be a little bit annoying. Back to the gloom as I just talk about the screen surface a little bit more and things I like about it, and that's that it just doesn't have any layering or graininess. There's no matte film, so it looks very smooth. And again, there's the direct emission of light, but also just how smooth everything appears in terms of the lack of graininess. Even when you're looking at very light shades, there's just no mistiness to them from the screen surface. Another reason some people really like glossy screen surfaces like this. I'm now on lagom.nl, the website and the test for viewing angles. I'm going to talk a little bit about colour consistency, and that is how a shade is presented at different points of the screen. If you paid attention in the contrast section, you'll note I said that the gamma consistency is exceptional, as it usually is for an OLED, and that is indeed related to the viewing angle performance and the colour consistency, which is also exceptional. So the Lagom text, it looks very even, no issues there. It indicates the low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. The purple block, that looks very consistent. It always looks odd in the video. It looks like there's this kind of pink blob and it's purple elsewhere, but it doesn't look like that to the eye at all. It looks very consistent. The red block, a nice rich red throughout the screen. No complaints with that. I mean, if you look very closely at the extreme edges, you could say it's a little bit brighter. That's just because of the bezels. It could even be sort of a little bit of an optical illusion going on here. It's nothing to worry about. Same with the green block. Again, it looks a little bit brighter there, just at the bezels. And the rest of it, a nice saturated green chartreuse shade throughout. And the blue block, a nice consistent royal blue throughout. I also observed various grey shades, including dark greys, 5% grey, that kind of thing, just to look for DSE, dirty screen effect. It wasn't an issue here. I don't generally find it an issue on QD-OLEDs, but sometimes on WOLED monitors there are slight issues. So it's not something which I'm going to show you in the video, the very minor striations in places for some shades, because on the video, especially with YouTube compression, but not only that, it tends to exaggerate it just the way it's captured on the camera, whereas by eye it's so subtle that I don't think it's really worth mentioning much at all. I'm on Battlefield 2042 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. If you're using a gamut on the monitor which goes beyond sRGB and you're observing standard content, so this game running an SDR or a game running an SDR, or you're on the desktop and you're not in a colour managed environment, you're watching a movie, something like that, then this content is usually designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. So with the wider colour gamut on the monitor, you get extra saturation and extra vibrancy. So this is what the colour gamut looked like under my test settings. So there's a 155.3% sRGB volume, so significant extension beyond in various places, but most significantly towards the red region. And comparing with DCI P3, remember the colourful line is the monitor, the rainbowy line, and the dotted line is the reference colour space, DCI P3 in this case. 97.8% DCI P3 coverage, and for those interested, this is 91.2% Adobe RGB coverage. So near complete coverage of DCI P3 with some extension beyond in places. So with this, yes, there's a lot of extra saturation and vibrancy. I can see that to the sky here, for example, quite a cartoonish look. No jokes about this game, please. I know it kind of makes sense to have a bit of a cartoonish look here, but it's just more saturated than intended even. Some very vibrant, strong-looking blue shades. The painted green there as well. A lot of pop to it, and that fire which just... oh dear, I better run away from that. Very vibrant. Yeah, so some strong oranges, so yellow's verging on orange too much and orange is verging on a sort of reddy orange shade. You'll also see with skin tones that they are often too saturated, have a bit of an overly tanned quality or sometimes a bit of a reddish or slightly too pink tint depending on the skin tone. And with woody tones as well, so the wood here for example looks a little bit richer than it should. Woody tones in general and earthy browns just aren't quite as neutral as they should be. Now, obviously, if you like things to look vibrant, then this is fine. You might really enjoy this look. If you don't, and you want things to look more as the developers intend within the constraints of the sRGB color space, then you want to be using perhaps sRGB emulation. As I covered earlier, there's the sRGB Cal mode, but there's also the more flexible color space sRGB setting. So with the display color space sRGB setting, you don't lose access to any other setting. Whereas with sRGB Cal mode, remember I just switched from wide gamut to sRGB Cal mode, so you might have noticed a sudden drop in saturation for that reason. You'll see that I don't have access to the colour menu anymore. Uniform brightness is locked off, contrast is locked off. I did go through this in the best settings video, but I might as well just quickly repeat it here. Various things locked off. So especially if you're just playing a game and you just want things to look more as the developers intend, I would really just generally recommend sticking to the display colour space sRGB setting. And also, if you're finding things a little bit undersaturated in places, you might want a little bit more, perhaps oversaturated, you want a little bit less. There's also saturation controls on the monitor, so you can adjust that. A main slider as well as 6-axis control of that if you really want to fine-tune things. That doesn't change the gamut specifically, but it will change the overall representation of various elements. Regardless of how you're achieving sRGB emulation on the monitor itself, the gamut recorded is the same at 97% sRGB, so there's not meaningful extension beyond now. It clamps effectively to sRGB. If you don't want to go as far as clamping to sRGB and you want some more saturation but not quite as much as the full native gamut, the DCI-P3 setting may be one you like to use. And I would recommend switching over to the 6500K white point because the user configuration with DCI-P3 mode is a bit weird and it gives quite a strong green tint where it doesn't with the other settings. But anyway, you get rid of that with the 6500K setting or appropriate adjustments manually to the colour channels. But not to get too sidetracked, now things look more like they did with the native gamut, although a little bit toned down. So the gamut now looks like this. You've got 96.2% DCI-P3 coverage, so there's a slight loss of coverage compared to natively, where I recorded 97.8%. But again, it's an effective clamp with no overextension to speak of. I'm just going to quickly cycle through sRGB DCI-P3 in my test settings just to see if you notice any difference on this particular scene. So there's the subdued sRGB mode, less subdued DCI-P3, and the fully saturated and vibrant native gamut under my test settings. So these gamut clamps, I do like them. I like the way they're implemented in terms of being fully flexible, and they do a good job at clamping to the appropriate colour space as well. And if you're using this monitor for colour critical work, then the exceptional consistency is really nice to have. It's nice just when you're observing game content as well in general, having the vibrancy throughout the screen. But also the colour space potential you have with really strong DCI-P3 coverage, full sRGB coverage, and pretty good but not amazing Adobe RGB coverage. There's a lot of flexibility there if you want to use the monitor for colour accurate work. And just to quickly show you, as usual for an OLED, particularly a QD-OLED, exceptional viewing angle performance. Doesn't matter where you're viewing the monitor from, kind of just looks like a picture on the wall in terms of how consistent it is, just doesn't shift. You don't have a loss of contrast or anything like that. No shifts in the colour. You might be able to see some shifts just because of the camera, but to the eye, exceptional consistency. I'm going to look now at the HDR performance of the monitor, jumping in straight to some figures. So this graph here, it shows various white patch sizes, or as some reviewers would call percentage white window. 1%, 4%, 9%, 25%, 49% and 100%. So there's a white patch covering that percentage of the screen's pixels and the rest of the screen is displaying pure black, except for 100% where of course the entire screen is white. The 100% reading is also a sustained reading taken 30 seconds after the shade is displayed, whereas the others are peak reading, so the highest luminance the monitor reached when the shade was displayed. The orange line shows the monitor using one of its high brightness modes for HDR, whereas the purple line shows the Display HDR 400 True Black setting, which is more consistent, as you can see, but also reaches lower peaks. I've also graphed the Dell Alienware AW3423DW just as a reference because that gives a very typical QD-OLED experience. It's a first generation QD-OLED, and you can see that the ASUS in this test, it's pretty similar really to the AW3423DW. Sometimes it is a bit lower and occasionally a little bit higher, but overall quite similar. But the usual trend is seen with increasing white patch sizes, reducing the peak luminance that will be observed or recorded. So the highest luminance being with a 1% patch size, 1026 nits, the minimum being 100% sustained, all the way down to 264 nits. With the true black setting, that's the same 264 nits for 100% sustained, whereas it'll only ever go up to 465 nits. So that's what I mean when I say it's more consistent. The high brightness setting I've graphed here, it's console HDR with dynamic brightness boost DBB disabled. The other high brightness settings, so excluding display HDR 400 to true black, they're offered similar brightness in this test, sometimes marginally higher, sometimes marginally lower, but it wasn't a dramatic difference, so that's why I haven't graphed them here. Either way, this test doesn't paint the full picture, so I'll come back to these settings using some real-world measurements a little bit later. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm running the game under HDR. The monitor responds to HDR10 content. In the best settings video, I explore the HDR settings of the monitor in some detail. I won't go through all of that again in this section, but I will be referencing a few settings. It's worth watching the best settings video for additional context, but to summarise my findings, having tested these settings extensively on the monitor, I'm really a bit split over which setting I personally prefer, but for me it's between console HDR with dynamic brightness boost or DBB disabled and cinema HDR. I'll be giving some examples in the review with both settings. In mainly dark scenes, I do like the console HDR with DBB disabled because it gives an appropriate look to darker elements whilst giving nice pop to smaller bright elements and good uncrushed highlight detail, so it would work well in this scene for example. But I can appreciate the cinema HDR setting, which similarly provides good brightness peaks without crushing highlight detail, but it also gives a nice boost to medium shades in daylight scenes. The negative compared to console HDR without DBB is that it gives an uplifted look to medium dark shades. I wouldn't say it's an extreme uplift, or not as extreme as I've seen on some models, and it doesn't affect the darkest shades either, so they remain nice and deep. And because it has per pixel illumination like usual for an OLED, you get an excellent nuanced shade variety that's also enhanced by the use of 10-bit processing, so it really can show a very nice array of closely matching dark shades. And there's no particular black crush or anything like that going on of note, which would mask the dark shades more than they should be masked. So it definitely shows the variety and depth of various shades in a very nice way. Also, being an OLED with per pixel illumination, it can have very bright shades or bright shades right next to very dark shades with no haloing, just an immediate transition between the light and dark. As I mentioned in the best settings video, if you're playing in a room that's at least moderately bright, then you might actually find the generally uplifted look of the cinema setting, which I'm using at the moment in a dark room. You might find that appropriate and nice to have. In a dark room, your preferred setting, it might vary depending on the scene and your own preferences. Again, I'll be giving you more context with some specific examples shortly. Jumping into the water now, which I love to do in this scene or on this game. The one represents this scene nicely, so you've got a nice variety of bright shades using the settings I prefer, including console HDR. So the nuanced shade variety, the 10-bit color reproduction, helps smooth out gradients and gives smoother weather effects and lighting effects, particle effects, that kind of thing. It also allows the monitor to put its wide color gamut to good use, which I'll explore a little bit later on. At the same time, the monitor is able to display a nice array of medium and darker shades. Some good depth there as well. And the glint of light on the water surface, it's nice and bright, nice and eye-catching. At least when it's actually on the screen it is. To note here that the colour temperature I recorded, as with SDR, was a bit on the warm side. It was around 6250K under HDR. It seemed to be consistent with various different settings as well, the different HDR presets, and it had a good green channel balance. You can adjust the colour channels if you enable adjustable HDR, as I explore in the best settings video. That is an option. To give you some more figures, I mentioned that glint of light on the water surface is nice and bright, and this is how bright it is with various different HDR presets. So the brightest recorded was 971 nits. It does vary a bit. These readings aren't absolute because the glint does get smaller and larger at different points, and it covers a different amount of the colorimeter sensor area and can cause the ABL to kick in a bit more when it grows sometimes. But these are sort of what I observed at the upper end with this glint. So console HDR was the brightest, followed by gaming HDR at 817 nits, console HDR with dynamic brightness boost in use 785 nits, cinema HDR 776 nits. Now, just an observation with these high brightness HDR settings, the reason that the console HDR setting most likely gave the highest value here, that's with DBB disabled incidentally, was because it darkens out lots of the medium shades more, so it can really push out its highest brightness levels for that glint. There's also some differences in how they're calibrated, as I explore in the best settings video, but this in combination did make this particular element brighter. But if I was showing you a different element with a different makeup on the scene, then it could be a different story with the different settings. So don't get too hung up about this. Also at the bottom there, not to be forgotten, display HDR 400 true black with 460 nits recorded for this element, so that's about as bright as things will get ever with that setting. Again, it's quite consistent. And also be aware, I did recalibrate HDR in the game appropriately for each of the different settings. I'm on another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again running an HDR. I've actually got the console HDR setting on at the moment with DBB disabled. That's actually my preferred setting for this kind of scene, and certainly for this particular scene. But QD-OLEDs in general, they do present this nicely as long as they're pretty well calibrated, as this one is. So there's a really lovely look, a nice silver with a sort of purple rim for the glint of light there. Really nice, bright, eye-catching glint there. And there's a lovely array of very dark and medium dark shades here. So excellent detail without things looking flooded or too uplifted or anything like that. So if I'm sitting in a dark room like this, I can appreciate those little details using the console HDR DBB disabled setting. I'm going to stop saying DBB disabled, by the way. When I mention console HDR from now on, unless I'm explicit otherwise, I'm talking about with DBB disabled. Switching over to cinema HDR, gives an uplifted look here, brings out the details so that they look brighter than they should. It doesn't really look as atmospheric. It's not terrible again, it's not an extreme uplift, but it is a fairly strong uplift, certainly one you'll notice in a dark room. But what if you're in a brighter room? Well, actually the subtle details and the uplift to those, it's actually quite useful. You can see the little subtle details better with this cinema HDR setting than you can with console HDR. Really, the masking's too heavy now. So just as a general point, I'd say that I have used the monitor extensively now for HDR game and movie content. And when using it for my own enjoyment, so to speak, and not specifically testing things, I do often sit in a room with a bit of daylight in it. A bit like this, maybe a little bit more controlled than this, but I made sure it was quite bright to ensure it looked appropriate on the video, and the comparison was at least quite clear there. So I can certainly see the appeal of the cinema setting, and actually I find it's often the setting I gravitate towards. Back to the darkness now, although showing a bright scene on a game. A different game here, Battlefield 5, again running an HDR. And this particular scene is notoriously unforgiving for OLED monitors. It causes the ABL behaviour to kick in heavily. There are plenty of medium to bright shades being displayed, and the brightness is significantly limited for bright elements such as the sun and bright patches of snow and sun glints on the ice. So it certainly doesn't look like this scene would look on a mini LED monitor, for example, a good mini LED monitor. It's also worth noting that on games with bright HUD elements, you'll notice a shift in their brightness when shifting between an ABL limited scene like this and one that isn't as heavily ABL limited, like the Shadow of the Tomb Raider scenes I showed you earlier. Of course, you're not going to mind when you're hopping from game to game, but certainly different scenes and games will have different ABL levels kicking in, and it can make those HUD elements shift a lot. If you don't like that kind of shifting and you prefer the greater consistency, again, that's where the display HDR 400 true black setting might come in handy. Regardless of the HDR preset used, assuming brightness is left at 100, the sun is approximately 350 nits in this scene. Sometimes a touch brighter or dimmer depending on what's going on with the rest of the scene, but it's roughly there. The representation of medium shades is significantly impacted by the HDR preset used, however. So think about the sky to the right of the sun there. These are the kind of shades which can be impacted a lot by the HDR preset. So let's throw out some more figures. Again, focusing on the two settings I like to use, I definitely prefer the representation using cinema HDR to console HDR in this particular scene I'm talking about, and you can see from the graph why that might be. That's because the console HDR setting, with DBB disabled, really dulls those medium shades down a lot. The remaining settings, they're pretty similar, between 193 and 206 nits. Technically gaming HDR was recorded as the brightest, but there's really not much in it. It's just when you compare console HDR with DBB disabled to any of the other configurations. Also be aware that a slightly different patch of sky is used in different reviews. It's difficult to get the exact same shade recorded, but the exact same patch of sky is used for all of these measurements in this review. So I'm using the Cinema HDR setting at the moment, and actually the representation in this scene, it's pretty similar to the nicely calibrated Display HDR 400 True Black setting. There's a little bit of an edge with the True Black setting. I can't show you this in the video, but it's just something I can observe by eye in that it gives a bit of extra depth to some of the shadowy areas such as the rocks and also nearby building interiors, that kind of thing. But the Cinema HDR setting does a decent job here, and it makes sure those medium shades or medium to bright shades aren't dragged down. Again, with all of this testing I'm doing on this scene, I do recalibrate the game's HDR appropriately for each of the different setting combinations. I'm on another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'm just going to quickly talk about colour reproduction. Under SDR, I noted lots of oversaturation when you use the full native gamut, and that's because the content is designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. Under HDR, on the other hand, the developers are able to target wider colour gamuts such as DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020, which is a very wide gamut. So this monitor's colour gamut, it extends to around 78% Rec 2020. So you can see it's not complete Rec 2020 coverage. No monitor I reviewed has got complete Rec 2020 coverage, but this is still a good level, and you've got near complete DCI-P3 coverage. So with this and how ASUS has mapped the colours, it offers a good level of vibrancy, at least where you'd want or expect the vibrancy, but there's a toning down compared to under SDR, which is appropriate. So these green shades, they look nice and deep and lush, with toned down yellowish tones so they don't look completely bright and overdone and out of place. Sky blues as well, this is more like a sky grey in this scene, but just in general the sky blues will be toned down a bit as well. And the woody shades, which I mentioned, were too rich and had a bit of an orangey red push under SDR using the full native gamut. They're also toned down, but they don't look, washed out or anything like that. And actually there does appear to be a little bit of oversaturation remaining for these particular shades, but it's not heavy. And also when I look at Laura's skin tone, it's definitely toned down compared to under SDR. It looks a lot more appropriate now. So overall, I did enjoy using this monitor under HDR. I like the collection of HDR presets, particularly the console HDR with DBB disabled and Cinema HDR. Yes, it really depends on if I'm sitting in a darker room or if I'm sitting in a bit of a brighter room as to my own preference. I don't like continually switching between them for different scenes in a game. Sometimes it might just depend on my mood. Sometimes I'm sort of happy to have the uplifted look. Other times I just want to have a sort of deep atmospheric experience. It really just depends what I'm going for. But I did like having that choice, and it's not a choice which is always afforded to you on QD-OLED monitors. More often than not, they'll give you an experience like the console HDR with DBB disabled, where you've got that dragging down of medium shades. It would happen quite a lot in scenes like this. Sometimes they do have a mode where it'll give you uplifted medium shades. Often they go too far, and it's too extreme with the uplift. I think the balance ASUS struck here with the Cinema HDR settings is actually quite good. And I'm going to cover the responsiveness of the monitor. So these are some pursuit photographs taken using Test UFO. If you're not familiar with pursuit photographs or any of the other terminology I'm using in this section, please refer to the responsiveness article, which is linked to in the video description. So you can see with a boost from 60 to 120 and further to 240 Hz, there's a nice reduction in perceived blur due to eye movement, which is why the UFO is more sharply focused. There are no additional weaknesses due to slower than optimal pixel responses either, so no overshoot or conventional trailing behind the UFOs. At 240 Hz you can also see the white notches are nice and visible and countable. That's because of the exceptional pixel response performance. If you compare this to the reference screen, that is a fast IPS model, an RCA Evolution Premium running at 240 Hz. The internal details of the UFO aren't as visible, and there's also some trailing and a bit of overshoot in places behind the UFO. I know some of you prefer figures, so here are some figures. These are taken using the OSRTT Pro tool. That's the same tool and the same methodology used by TFT Central, although they make some adjustments to OLED screens like this. Now the reason for that is that because of the brightness regulation method, the cyclical brightness dips I mentioned earlier in the review, that can throw the readings off, particularly when they're involving extreme examples, so some from the first column or rows here. And actually the accuracy is thrown off even more when the refresh rate is lower. So this is at 240 Hz, it's not too bad, but there are what I would consider some phantom readings still. So the initial response times, the first row there, where they've got 2.5 milliseconds and 2.1 milliseconds, they're what I consider phantom readings. In practice, they're really around 1 millisecond or faster. And there's a little bit of overshoot recorded with a just into the gold from the green, so golden green value, but that is for the top row, and again, that can be considered a phantom reading. I observed these particular transitions by eye and various others, and I didn't perceive any overshoot. Whether it's recording this particularly accurately or not, it's not something I would worry about at all. So what you get here, an average initial time at 0.83 milliseconds, no perceived overshoot. It's a really nice experience as you'd expect from an OLED monitor. And because of the inaccuracies I mentioned that get worse at lower refresh rates, I'm not going to go through any particular figures at lower refresh rates. I'm back on Battlefield 5. I'm running the game at 240 frames a second, so I'm making the most out of the 240Hz refresh rate of the monitor. So as I mentioned, with the exceptional pixel response performance, really the visually flawless sample and hold 240Hz performance you get here, really nice experience when you're gaming. It gives you a nice connected feel as well. That's further aided by low input lag. On this monitor I measured a very low input lag, 0.55 milliseconds for the 240Hz refresh rate, which certainly gives a lovely connected feel. So the precision and fluidity you feel when you're interacting with the game world. Without even the most minor weaknesses perceived in pixel responses or any overshoot, you don't get any additional perceived blur from the pixel response element in any way, so brickwork on the wall here, for example, maintains a sharper focus than you'd normally see on a non-OLED monitor. I'm on another scene on Battlefield 5. This one is one which LCDs typically struggle with, VA panels in particular, but IPS panels as well will show some weaknesses. You've got very dark shades with bright to medium shades in the background, and various other shade combinations as well involving a mixture of dark and lighter shades. On this OLED, I don't observe any weaknesses. You may see some just from the video, there could even be from your own monitor, but to the eye, no perceived weaknesses at all. The usual exceptional OLED performance here. So moving straight on to VRR, the monitor supports variable refresh rate technologies. You can use NVIDIA G-Sync compatible, you can use AMD FreeSync Premium, you can use HDMI 2.1 VRR for systems that don't actually support adaptive sync, such as the PS5 as well. So in other words, you've got console compatibility on the PS5, Xbox Series X and the PC for VRR. You can use HDR at the same time as well if you wish. The range of operation for VRR on this monitor is 48 to 240 Hz. And below 48 Hz it can use LFC, low frame rate compensation, where the monitor sticks to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate to keep tearing and stuttering at bay. And it does indeed work very well to keep tearing and stuttering at bay, as you'd hope from a VRR. I'm just going to quickly talk about the 120 and 60 Hz experience. At 120 Hz now, so I've got the game running at 120 frames a second, the monitor's running at 120 Hz to match that, using VRR. At 120 Hz, the monitor performs flawlessly, whether you're using VRR or not, in terms of the pixel response performance again. No overshoot, no perceived weaknesses in pixel responses. The perceived blur does increase due to eye movement, and there's a drop-off in connected feel just because you've now got half the frame rate that I was having before. So that is noticeable, but that's not a fault of the monitor. Running the game now at 60 frames a second, the monitor's running at 60 Hz. And again, no weaknesses, no overshoot, no conventional trailing. Perceived blur due to eye movement has increased significantly now, much as I was showing you with the perceived photographs, and indeed the connected feel has dropped off significantly, with the lower frame rate really not helping in that respect. The monitor does have VRR flicker or VRR flickering, as is a general characteristic of OLED monitors. I'm now running a little test which shows VRR flicker. Now this particular test, it causes significant and rapid fluctuations in the refresh rate of the display, so the frame rate of the test changes all the time, and you can see the refresh rate of the display in the top left there. You can see it's going all over the place, and there's accompanying flickering. So the flickering, for those who aren't familiar, it's a gamma shift which occurs in a VRR environment as the frame rate changes, and therefore the refresh rate of the monitor changes. It's more noticeable where there are significant fluctuations like this occurring, and it's only clearly observed for dark or dark to medium shades. So really for this part of the gradient and beyond. You can see it a little bit for brighter shades as well, but in general the flickering is exaggerated somewhat in the video. And the camera will pick it up a lot more for the brighter shades in a way that your eye doesn't really see it at all. But by eye, I can see pretty much constant flickering here, at least for the dark to medium shades. And really that's just like what I've seen on other QD-OLEDs. In most in-game scenes or situations, you're not going to get such brutal and continuous fluctuations as I'm showing you here. There are only certain scenes or situations where it might be this obvious. And of course the gradient here makes it quite easy to notice as well. But I certainly have observed it in-game, and also in loading screens and in-game maps, that kind of thing. There is a setting called OLED Anti-Flicker, which ASUS has included on some of their newer models. The ROG Strix XG27UCDMG I'm looking at here, that has OLED Flicker 2.0 specifically. And this builds on the first generation of the technology, and I'd highly recommend viewing our video on that if you're not familiar. I've linked that in the video description. It just gives you some more background and detailed assessment of this particular feature. But the 2.0 version of the anti-flicker, in addition to modifying the VRR range, it also includes a luminance compensation algorithm which helps subdue perceived flicker. ASUS claims it reduces perceived flicker by up to 20%. To use the feature, you have to have variable refresh rate enabled, and you need to be connected via DisplayPort. Doesn't work over HDMI. If you set the monitor below 240Hz, which it seems you can actually do with this feature enabled, it will still have a VRR range which allows it to run all the way up to 240Hz, which I know is a little bit confusing, but that seems to be how they've done it. So really this feature is meant to be used for a 240Hz experience. So on the screen here, you will see the refresh rate ranges of the various OLED anti-flicker settings, and that's specific to the XG27UCDMG I'm reviewing at the moment. It may well be the same for various other ASUS models, depending on the refresh rate that is supported. But in this case, with the setting disabled, you got 48 to 240Hz VRR range. LFC is used below 48Hz. The middle setting gives you an 80 to 240Hz VRR range. LFC is used below 80Hz. The high setting gets a bit confusing because it has a 140 to 240Hz VRR range. It has a dead zone without VRR between 121 and 139Hz, and LFC is used at or below 120Hz. So that dead zone naturally kills any potential flickering, just as if you disabled VRR yourself, but LFC can't be used there, as even the lowest multiplication, 2 times the frame rate for refresh rate, would exceed the maximum 240Hz of the display. So I'm just going to share some observations on this VRR flicker test. As noted earlier, with the offsetting, which I'm using at the moment, I can see pretty much constant flickering. It's in line with what I've seen on other QD-OLEDs. I've now switched over to the middle setting and reopened the test just to make sure it's activating correctly. I don't know how this is going to look on the video, but I can say that by eye, things have changed a bit. The most intense flickering observed here is observed less frequently, though given how aggressive the fluctuations are on this test, it's still fairly frequent here. Overall, I do still perceive less flickering with this setting, both less frequent and less intense, compared to with the setting disabled. I'm now using the high setting for OLED Anti-Flicker, and I've reopened the test. Really, it's similar to middle in the test in terms of the frequency of the flickering, but any flickering I observe here is pretty mild. I don't really notice pulses of more intense flickering as I saw with the other 2 settings, and that's simply because the refresh rate fluctuations are far less extreme now. I'm going to share some in-game observations. I'm on Cyberpunk 2077. Now, it is difficult to show you the flickering accurately in-game, so I'm really going to talk about this more than I'm going to show you things. As I demonstrated in the video of the first generation OLED anti-flicker, it really depends on the fluctuations occurring. In particular, if you're frequently crossing the LFC boundary of whatever setting you're using, then it could induce some relatively strong flickering. Now, I don't like the high setting here, and that's because I really dislike having an 18Hz dead zone from 121 to 139Hz, where VRR just completely disables itself. Even with my RTX 5090, there are some scenes in some games where I'll be in or cross through that range, and I find the sudden introduction of tearing and stuttering quite jarring. I do like the middle setting though, and that's what I'm using at the moment. I just get a general feeling of reduced flickering using this setting. That certainly applies in the game itself, but also when I'm on menu systems in games and in maps. There's usually quite obvious VRR flickering with the setting disabled, whereas with the setting set to middle, it's much less of an issue. Now, a problem I had with the first generation of the technology was that when the frame rate was around 80 frames a second, the LFC boundary was crossed using this middle setting, and purposely using the scene here because, first of all, it's a good one for showing VRR flickering, and second of all, I've set things up specifically so it's crossing the LFC boundary using the middle setting, so it's going above and below 80 frames a second consistently, which is why it's suddenly jumping up to nearly 200 and then right back down. So these are massive fluctuations. But even with that, I think really the luminance compensation algorithm does actually help quite a lot here, and it just blunts the flickering. I know in the video you can probably see a fairly constant flickering at the moment there. You don't actually observe that by eye, certainly not in the same way. So this is why I said it's hard to show you in the video what things would actually look like by eye. but you'll just have to take my word for it that I do prefer this implementation to the first generation of the technology. Now, given the overall reduction in flickering elsewhere using the setting, not when I've specifically set a game up to purposefully cross the LFC boundary of the middle setting. Honestly, it doesn't happen very much when I'm gaming most of the time. I spend a lot of time in the triple digits. So it's not perfect. I would say that if you're frequently crossing this LFC boundary with the middle setting, so that's happening all the time in your games, then you might as well not use the middle setting. You're probably better off using the off setting, just because it will shift the LFC boundary down, so you're not going to be crossing it. But that's a very specific scenario, and in most cases you're going to be playing different games, and different scenes in the games will have different kind of performance, so you probably will find the middle setting better than the off setting, but you just have to experiment for yourself for your own system on your own games. Because I do feel it really has improved the technology from 1.0 to 2.0, I'm quite curious to see what happens with the third generation of the technology, if there is one. Definitely further improvements can be made. It's far from perfect. There's still VRR flickering, certainly still a feature, and sensitive users may well find it bothersome with any setting depending on the fluctuations occurring. So it would be nicer if they had some way of, really compensating with gamma changes so that you just don't notice it at all, or it's super mild all the time. The monitor also supports ELMB, Enhanced Low Motion Blur. This is a BFI black frame insertion technology. To use the setting, you have to be running at 120 Hz under SDR, and you have to have uniform brightness, adaptive sync, and OLED Anti-Flicker disabled. It does appear to use uniform brightness and force it on, however. The brightness using this setting, it's 130 nits maximum and 7 nits minimum, or thereabouts. The setting alternates between showing the image for half the refresh cycle and a black frame for the other half of the refresh cycle. So because it's a perfect half and half, it means that although you're running the monitor at 120 Hz, it gives you 240 Hz like clarity, and you can see that from the image, but with those restrictions I've mentioned, plus the fact that the screen is naturally flickering in a more pronounced way. So really it's a bit of a niche feature, especially with technologies like GPU frame generation really taking off at the moment, but some people still might like to use it. It would work on any game or application, including 120 Hz console gaming, for example. To wrap up then, I quite like the build of the monitor. I'm actually personally a fan of this compared to the more fussy ROG Swift styling. It's just a personal thing. Even though I do like metal on the stand, and this one doesn't have that, it has a plasticky stand, it's really nice and solid and robust feeling anyway. I just prefer the simpler design and smaller stand footprint. In terms of the performance, you get a lovely pixel density because of the screen size and the resolution. So that's a really nice combination. I personally really like it for productivity and gaming, that particular combination. Of course, speaking of productivity, it is an OLED and you do have to be aware of burn-in. There are various mitigation measures to help with that, but ultimately it will depend on how you use the monitor. It's not something which I can personally recommend someone use for extensive productivity work. I do happily use QD-OLEDs myself for mixed use, including some productivity, but burn-in isn't something I can specifically assess on this model with the few weeks I have to review it. This monitor does include a 3-year warranty with burn-in protection. The overall performance was much in line with what I've seen with other QD-OLEDs, and that's not a bad thing at all. It's really very strong when it comes to areas like contrast. Of course, there are some quirks with the screen surface to be aware of. You have to be a little bit careful with your lighting, but if you are, you're greeted with a very rich and dynamic experience. Also, nice vibrant colour output. ASUS calibrated it quite well, and I also appreciate the flexibility they give with the sRGB and DCI-P3 colour space emulation settings. Really nice to see that. The HDR was enjoyable on the monitor. I think they have a nice set of presets there. It also put the colour gamut to good use under HDR. I didn't find that they messed up the calibration there in any way. Some shades had a little bit of extra saturation, but it was still toned down compared to under SDR, and it really just gave the nice kind of look which I would expect, quite a natural and in-place look with a little bit of extra saturation, and certainly strong saturation where the developers actually want it to be. So it's making good use of its wide colour gamut. The responsiveness, as usual for an OLED, was excellent. 240Hz experience was really spot on, really nice for competitive play, and also just a general gaming experience. And even on the desktop, actually, I'm starting to quite like 240Hz just when I'm on the desktop even. That's what happens when you get used to these high refresh rate monitors, I'm afraid. VRR did work well, and actually as far as the OLED experience goes, yes, there was VRR flickering, or VRR flicker as they usually is, but I actually quite liked the Anti-Flicker 2.0 technology that they include. I found that the middle setting there did actually reduce my overall perceived flicker when I was gaming, and that's a good thing. It's not perfect and it doesn't completely eliminate flicker, but I still think it was progress. I preferred it to the first generation of the technology, and I'm quite looking forward to seeing if further things can be done to reduce VRR flicker on OLEDs. I know that's one thing which does really put some people off, especially if they're sensitive to this kind of flicker. Another feature I quite liked, I did mention this in the best settings video, I might as well mention it here because it wasn't really in the review video, is a Neo proximity sensor. It worked well. It's just nice to have the screen switch off shortly after you leave the room or you leave your desk, and then it springs back to life very quickly when you return. The only thing I would say is that it doesn't let the pixel refresh cycle run unless Windows Power Management is sending the screen to sleep or you've turned the screen off using the power button, so that is something you have to be aware of. So overall, really did enjoy using this monitor. It offers a nice performance and I really do like the feature set. I also like the pricing, which is obviously very important to consider. As covered in the review, I really don't see DisplayPort 2.1 as something that's worth paying more for on monitors like this. So with the XG27UCDMG retailing just under $1,000 or roughly £950, I think it's an excellent choice. By paying $200 or so more, you could get the ROG Swift model, so the PG27UCDM, and you get the ROG Swift styling, which could be a good or bad thing depending on your preferences. You get DisplayPort 2.1 and you get Dolby Vision support. For HDR PC gaming, Dolby Vision is essentially absent. It is a nice little bonus for HDR movie content, but unless that's something you're a real connoisseur of and something you're really consuming a lot of, then I don't really feel it's worth paying the extra for that. Another option which is priced similarly to this XG27UCDMG, or a bit below it, is the Dell Alienware AW2725Q. Haven't used it myself, but other reviewers and regular users have noted poor HDR calibration with very wonky EOTF tracking, throwing things off there. And there are some mentions as well of a whining fan, which of course could be very annoying. The ASUS doesn't have a fan, so that's one less thing to worry about. With all this said, I am happy to recommend the XG27UCDMG. For the performance, the price and the feature set, I think they've done really well here. So that's really all there is to this monitor. You'll find a link to additional content in the description of the video, as well as information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.